Welcome to today's Ecom Sales Tax podcast, where we answer the questions that all of you e-commerce sellers and other businesses have about the new legislation with Wayfair and any other new updates that come from that. Today we've got Jason Parr and we've got Dan Pizer on the line with us. Welcome, guys.
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
We've got some good discussion here today. Last week we kind of covered, that every company needs to have a Nexus review and some good reasons why. And I've been getting questions about, these businesses, get signed up with sales tax software or some other service, and they're told they need to get registered in a bunch of states. And I just wanted to cover kind of what a Nexus review is, what the process is, and what companies can benefit from a Nexus review.
So let me just talk about that briefly. We said last week that every company that has customers in the U.S. needs a Nexus study, and I still hold to that. I think it's really valuable. But I talk to e-commerce sellers every single day, and the big question is, what does that look like? What does that mean? What's going to be required of me? So I thought it might be valuable just to share a little bit of detail on what a Nexus study looks like. So when I say Nexus study, essentially we're trying to understand what your exposure might be. When I say exposure, I'm always talking about tax dollars paid out of your own pocket. That's the last thing anybody wants to do. It's always associated with penalties and interest, and it's always upsetting. So we try to avoid that. So an exposure review consists of starting with Nexus. Essentially, we do a Nexus study. We want to understand what your Nexus footprint is. And there's a couple of different ways that Nexus can be established. And so it's important to know that, yes, we look at economic and transactional thresholds that have been established state by state ever since Wayfair. And as I understand it, all states will have some sort of economic nexus and effective dates that will probably happen this year. And so that's significant. But we also look at other nexus creating activities, the most prevalent one being physical nexus. And so a nexus study is the first step in an exposure review, and it's to look at your nexus footprint. It's to establish or identify what your first date of nexus was and when your first obligation to collect and remit a tax may have been. The next step to that naturally would be to look at your sales everywhere and to understand how those sales are impacted by your Nexus footprint. And so we're not looking at all of your sales and making that determination in an automated format. We're actually doing a taxability review of your sales and identifying your taxable sales in those jurisdictions and trying to understand what your situation could be. So then the third step in an exposure review is just that. We take your Nexus footprint, your first date of Nexus, we look at your taxable sales over those periods of time, and then we apply average tax rates and average penalties and interest associated with exposure that you may have in relation to your Nexus footprint and your taxable sales. And then from that, we deliver that to you, and then we present to you some recommendations on what we think you should do. There's usually two types of recommendations that occur. One would be a prospective registration, just to make sure that you become compliant with the state and you begin collecting and remitting tax. When that happens, you might have a situation where you need your platforms that you sell on. Maybe you sell on Amazon, eBay, Walmart, Shopify through your own website, Magenta. All of these different platforms have different methods for turning on the tax, so to speak. So we want to stop the bleeding. We want to get you collecting tax, and we want to get you registered and remitting that tax properly. The second method to become compliant, if your exposure is fairly material and it goes back several years, then we may want to consider a voluntary disclosure program. And we call them VDAs. In a VDA, you have the opportunity to negotiate with the state to limit how far back they look. And they also will waive penalty, and some states will waive interest or some of the interest. And so they can be very helpful in reducing that out-of-pocket exposure that you might have from not collecting tax. So the steps, we do a Nexus study. Second step, we do a taxability review to understand your taxable sales. Third step, we do an exposure analysis to understand what your potential exposure could be. And then we work with you on a collaborative basis, state by state, to determine whether you should register prospectively or potentially participate in a VDA program or an amnesty program if it's available, to try to mitigate the out-of-pocket costs to you. Now, along those lines, I would ask Dan, because Dan has seen the horror stories. A lot of people want to know, hey, listen, I've already used an automated software trial or process to determine what my Nexus footprint is based on economic nexus specifically. And we agree, that's wonderful. And we use that a lot of times to help you get registered in the proper jurisdictions. But Dan, why might somebody want to actually step back one step and look at other types of nexus that could have been established in historical periods?
Well, Jason, and that's an excellent question. And the reason that somebody would want to maybe take a step back and look at historically is everybody has gotten, ever since Wayfair came out, has gotten hyper-focused on the economic nexus. It's new, it's shiny, it's in your face. Every outlet has published something on it. And so everybody's paying careful attention to that $100,000 that most states are putting out, or 200 transactions, with a number of states now actually backing off the 200 transactions. And what they forget is that long before that came along, you still had physical nexus in all of the fulfillment by Amazon states by the simple operation of inventory going into a state's warehouse. And so when we look at these nexus factors, we're going to look at the most common ones, such as where is your inventory located? When did you first have inventory in a state to the point that it's meaningful? We look at all that when we make our nexus determinations. And then we're also going to look at some of the less common forms of nexus. That person you've got working from home in that non-Amazon state that you didn't think about, they could very well be giving you nexus. That if you also have gone to a trade show in a couple of states, that could potentially give you nexus, although that leads to some even more detailed questions. So we really try to look at all facets of your nexus footprint beyond just the usual determinants that are common to e-commerce sellers, to really get the idea of where you could have some exposure, and then we build things out from there. And one thing that we wanted to stress is that it's a collaborative process. When we started off, we discuss your business, ask some common questions, and really try to get a picture of what you do and what you sell, because even taxability wise, that can affect the outcomes of these. And then once it's done, we're going to have a discussion once it's presented to go over what the picture looks like, what your options are realistically. And also, if some of these states really don't look like what you're expecting, then we'll talk about those and see maybe there's an exemption you hadn't thought about, maybe there's some factor that you didn't mention to us that we can, by making us aware, we can adjust. So it really is we try to make it a collaborative process to really get that picture as accurately as we can within bounds.
Yeah, well said, Dan. You know, a lot of I don't want to scare anybody away from having a nexus study or an evaluation done. A lot of times what can happen is someone says, it sounds like that's going to cost me a lot of money. It sounds like it's going to cost me a lot of money to do the analysis. And it sounds like it's going to cost me a lot of money out of my own pocket if we look at this type of nexus. But the only thing we would alert everyone to is it's not very expensive to go through this process and to understand what your footprint might be and what your exposure might be. And more importantly, the last thing we want to do, we're happy to take we're happy to send you a matrix of thresholds that you can compare to your 2018 sales, and you can tell us where you think you want to get registered, and we'll assist you and help you move forward in that way. That doesn't cost you anything from an analysis standpoint. But the last thing we want to do is register you somewhere and expose you to a state where you could have had historical activity that created net.
I think we might have lost Jason. Dan, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Maybe you can finish his statement.
I think what Jason was saying is that the last thing that we would like to do is expose you to back taxes, penalty, and interest in a state where you had some kind of a historical nexus and could potentially have exposure without making you aware of the full range of options that are out there. And keep in mind that we act in an advisory capacity. We're not going to automatically go out there on our own volition and start, after doing this, and start just registering you or enrolling you in expensive programs. We're going to sit down and walk through it all with you step by step, and really and make you as informed as possible, because in the end the choice is going to be yours and yours alone as to what you do and where you do it.
Excellent. I don't know if we're going to get Jason back, but it sounds like for those sitting on the fence, it's, the cost versus the benefit. It's a greater benefit, even if you come out on the other side of this analysis. You're going to come out much better.
Hey,
even
I
if
made
you
it
don't.
back.
Oh,
Welcome
great!
Back. I apologize, having some internet difficulties. I don't know how far I got in that, but I just wanted to let everybody know one of the cautions we have in just register based on economic nexus alone, whether you've done a trial on a software package, determine what your nexus footprint may be, or whether we provide you a matrix of the thresholds and you compare them to your own sales in 2018, is because if it's determined that you had activities that created nexus in a prior period, the penalties can be very onerous. And so if we were to register you in a state that had, for instance, an Amazon fulfillment center, and you're an FBA seller, and you had inventory, because they can identify when you had inventory through the Amazon dashboard in a period in 14 or 15 or 16, then the end result is they can come back and claim that all of your sales from that period forward are taxable. And some states have penalties that are 30, 40, or 50% for non-collecting or non-filing. And so we want to be careful. The analysis is important, and we help online sellers on a daily basis identify what their footprint is and help them in this process of understanding where they should register, where they might consider doing a voluntary disclosure program. And our approach is always to mitigate out-of-pocket cost related to tax, penalties, and interest.
All right, thanks, guys. Down below in our show notes, I'll have provided a way to either contact me. You can also fill out possibly a strategy call or a free consultation to help you get started with your own Nexus review. You get started because you may be on the fence on whether or not you should get it done, but like we always say, every business should get it done. I mean, the cost versus the benefits far outweigh what the cost is. Even if you come out the other end and there's nothing that you need to do, you'll have the peace of mind to continue on your business. So thanks again, Jason and Dan. I hope to see you guys next week.
Thanks, Ryan.
Goodbye.